When I saw police lights flashing in my driveway at 6 a.m., I knew the HOA had finally lost their minds. They'd sent actual cops to my house over a property dispute. But here's the crazy part. I wasn't even part of their association. Looking back at how this all started, I never imagined a simple misunderstanding would escalate into such a nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had always dreamed of owning a corner lot house. After 20 years of saving and planning, I finally found the perfect place, a charming craftsman-style home in Pine Valley, just outside of Portland. The moment I drove past those mature oak trees lining the streets, I knew this was it. The house sat on a generous corner lot, painted a soft sage green with white trim, complete with a wraparound porch that reminded me of my grandmother's house in Vermont. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet enough to hear birds chirping in the morning, but close enough to downtown that I could still grab dinner with friends without making it an expedition. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was a retired high school teacher who immediately welcomed me with a homemade apple pie. On the other side lived the Patels, a young couple with twin toddlers who always waved enthusiastically whenever they saw me getting the mail. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Frank, had meticulously maintained the property for 3 decades. The hardwood floors still gleamed like new, and the kitchen had been recently updated with modern appliances while keeping its vintage charm. The real selling point, though, was the massive corner lot. It gave me twice the yard space of other houses in the area, and I immediately started dreaming up plans for a garden. My job as a software developer allowed me to work remotely most days, so I spent my first few months settling into a comfortable routine. Mornings were spent coding, on the porch, watching squirrels chase each other around the oak trees while sipping my coffee. In the afternoons, I'd take breaks to work on small home improvement projects, installing new light fixtures, painting the guest bedroom, or planning my future garden. The real estate process had been straightforward. My agent, Sarah, had helped me navigate everything smoothly, and the closing went without a hitch. The home inspector had found only minor issues, a loose gutter here, a slightly squeaky floorboard there, nothing that would make me second-guess my decision. The neighborhood didn't have any obvious restrictions that concerned me. Sure, there was an HOA presence in the area. The perfectly manicured lawns and matching mailboxes made that clear. But my property, along with a few others on the outskirts, had been specifically listed as independent from any homeowners association. That independence was actually one of the main reasons I chose this particular house. I'd heard enough HOA horror stories from friends to know I wanted no part of that bureaucracy. The ability to make decisions about my own property without consulting a board or following strict guidelines was non-negotiable for me. Sarah had even double-checked this detail during closing, confirming that my property was exempt from the local HOA's jurisdiction. Life felt pretty perfect those first few months. I hosted a small housewarming party where Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings, and the Patel's twins decorated my porch with chalk drawings of flowers. I started ordering supplies for my garden project, planning to transform the side yard into an urban oasis with raised vegetable beds and a small greenhouse. The previous owner had left detailed notes about the soil quality and sun exposure in different parts of the yard, which proved invaluable in my planning. I had no idea that my peaceful corner of suburban paradise was about to become ground zero for one of the most bizarre and frustrating battles of my life. Looking back, maybe I should have noticed the warning signs. The occasional disapproving glances from people walking their dogs past my house. The way certain neighbors would abruptly end their conversations when I approached, or the strange car that sometimes parked across the street, its occupant seemingly taking notes. But I was too caught up in my newfound happiness to see the storm brewing on the horizon. How was I supposed to know that my simple dream of creating a vegetable garden would spark a neighborhood war that would eventually involve the police, lawyers, and a showdown that would change the dynamics of our entire community forever? It all started with my garden project. After spending weeks researching sustainable gardening practices and drawing up detailed plans, I was ready to transform my side yard into something special. Not just any garden. I envisioned a thoughtfully designed space with raised beds, a charming greenhouse, and even a small meditation area where I could unwind after long days of coding. I'd been careful with my planning, making sure everything was properly scaled and aesthetically pleasing. The greenhouse would be a modest structure, just 8 by 10 feet, with Victorian-inspired architectural details to complement my home's craftsman-style. I'd chosen cedar for the raised beds, knowing they would weather beautifully and last for years. The meditation area would feature a small stone path leading to a handcrafted wooden bench, surrounded by lavender and native flowering plants. The project made perfect sense. The side yard was currently just an empty space with patchy grass, practically begging to be transformed into something useful. I'd even consulted with a local landscaper, Mike, who specialized in sustainable garden design. He helped me choose plants that would thrive in our climate and suggested ways to maximize the space while maintaining its visual appeal. "This is going to be a beautiful addition to your property," Mike had said during our consultation, sketching out possible layouts on his tablet. "The greenhouse location is perfect. It'll get great southern exposure without being too visible from the street, and these raised beds will actually help with drainage in this area." I spent hours researching local building codes and permit requirements. According to the city's website, my planned greenhouse fell well within the size limitations for structures not requiring a permit. The raised beds were classified as landscaping features, no different from flower beds or decorative borders. Everything seemed straightforward and completely within my rights as a homeowner. The cost wasn't insignificant, but I'd been saving specifically for home improvements. I'd already gotten quotes from several contractors and ordered the first batch of supplies: premium cedar boards for the raised beds, organic soil amendments, and heritage vegetable seeds. The greenhouse kit I'd selected was scheduled to arrive in 2 weeks. My immediate neighbors seemed supportive of the idea. Mrs. Chen was particularly excited, sharing stories about her own family's vegetable garden back in Taiwan and offering to exchange gardening tips. The Patels asked if their twins could help plant some flowers, and I happily agreed, thinking it would be a great way to teach them about growing their own food. I even created a detailed project timeline, breaking down the work into manageable phases. Phase 1 would be preparing the ground and building the raised beds. Phase 2 would involve installing the greenhouse and setting up the irrigation system. The final phase would focus on the meditation area and decorative touches. I estimated the entire project would take about 2 months, weather permitting. One Saturday morning, I woke up early, excited to begin. The cedar boards had arrived the previous day, and I'd arranged them neatly along the side of the house. I had my coffee on the porch, reviewing my plans one last time and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was crisp and clean, perfect weather for outdoor work. I was just about to start marking out the locations for the raised beds when I noticed a group of people walking purposefully toward my house. They were well-dressed, carrying clipboards and what looked like a camera. Something about their demeanor made me pause. They weren't walking like casual neighbors out for a morning stroll. They moved with the determined air of people on a mission. At first, I thought they might be real estate agents doing a neighborhood survey. We'd had a few houses go up for sale recently, and property values in the area had been rising steadily. But as they got closer, I noticed their expressions. stern, almost disapproving. One woman in particular, wearing a crisp blue blazer and carrying a leather portfolio, seemed to be leading the group. I had no way of knowing that these people were about to throw a massive wrench into my carefully laid plans. No way of anticipating that my simple garden project would trigger a chain of events that would upend my peaceful life and lead to one of the most challenging battles I'd ever face. In that moment, standing there with my coffee getting cold in my hands, I was still blissfully unaware that my dream of creating a sustainable garden oasis was about to collide head-on with a force I never even knew existed in our neighborhood. If I'd known what was coming, maybe I would have done things differently. Maybe I would have researched more thoroughly, asked more questions, or even chosen a different house entirely. But in that moment, all I could do was watch as they approached, clipboard-wielding harbingers of the chaos that was about to engulf my life. Everything started smoothly that morning. I began by carefully marking out the locations for the raised beds, using twine and wooden stakes to create precise outlines. The cedar boards were still stacked neatly against the house, their fresh, woodsy scent mingling with the crisp morning air. I had already laid out my tools: a level measuring tape, my cordless drill, and several boxes of heavy-duty screws. The first raised bed was coming together beautifully. I'd spent extra time ensuring the corners were perfectly square and the boards were level. Mrs. Chen had brought out a pitcher of iced green tea, commenting on how organized everything looked. She seemed genuinely excited about the project, sharing stories about the vegetables she hoped to help me grow once everything was established. "In my family's garden," she explained, setting the pitcher on my newly installed garden bench, "we always planted bok choy and Chinese broccoli. The soil here looks perfect for them." She bent down to examine the rich, dark earth I'd had delivered the previous week. "You've done your homework," she added approvingly. By mid-morning, I had completed 2 of the planned 6 raised beds. They looked exactly as I'd envisioned: clean lines, sturdy construction, and at just the right height for comfortable gardening. The Patel twins had wandered over with their parents, fascinated by the construction process. I let them help me measure the boards for the 3rd bed, their small faces serious with concentration as they held the tape measure. "Can we plant strawberries?" little Aisha asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Her brother Arun nodded enthusiastically. Beside her, I couldn't help but smile, already imagining them helping to harvest fresh berries next summer. "Of course," I promised. "We'll make sure to plant plenty of strawberries." Their parents looked on, clearly pleased with the educational opportunity the garden project was providing. The greenhouse kit was scheduled to arrive the following week, and I'd already prepared the area where it would stand. The ground had been leveled, and I'd laid a proper gravel foundation following the manufacturer's specifications. I'd even installed subtle landscape lighting along the planned pathway, solar-powered fixtures that would create a gentle glow in the evenings. Several other neighbors had stopped by throughout the morning, most offering encouraging words and expressing interest in the project. Old Mr. Peterson from 3 houses down brought over some heritage tomato seeds he'd been saving, explaining they were from a variety his grandfather had grown. Another neighbor, Maria, offered cuttings from her herb garden once everything was established. The sense of community building around the project was exactly what I'd hoped for. This wasn't just about creating a garden for myself. It was about fostering connections with my neighbors and creating something we could all enjoy. I'd even started sketching plans for a small free produce stand where I could share excess vegetables with the neighborhood. By early afternoon, I had completed 4 of the raised beds and was making steady progress on the 5th. The layout was taking shape exactly as planned, with clear pathways between the beds and plenty of space for the greenhouse. I'd even installed the first section of the irrigation system, running discreet black tubing along the backs of the beds. The weather couldn't have been more perfect, sunny but not too hot, with just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. I found myself falling into a pleasant rhythm of measuring, cutting, and assembling. The repetitive nature of the work was almost meditative, and I felt a deep satisfaction watching my vision come to life piece by piece. I was just finishing up the fifth bed when Mrs. Chen came out again, this time with a plate of dumplings. "You've been working so hard," she said, setting them down on the new garden bench. "Take a break and eat something." As I sat down to enjoy the dumplings, I looked over my progress with pride. The beds were perfectly aligned, the paths between them neat and well-defined. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. If only I'd known that this peaceful, productive day would be one of the last quiet moments I'd enjoy for months to come. But as I sat there, enjoying Mrs. Chen's dumplings and chatting with neighbors about future planting plans, I was completely unaware of the storm that was brewing. The clipboard-carrying group I'd noticed earlier was just the beginning. The first ripple in what would become a tidal wave of opposition to my simple garden project. Looking back now, I treasure the memory of that productive morning, the satisfaction of seeing my plans take shape, the warmth of community support, the simple pleasure of building something with my own hands. It was the calm before the storm, the last few hours of normalcy before my life would be turned upside down by forces I never saw coming. The group I'd noticed earlier made their way directly to my yard, their polished shoes clicking against the sidewalk with an air of authority. The woman in the blue blazer, who I would later come to know as Barbara Whitmore, cleared her throat loudly to get my attention. I was in the middle of checking the level on my sixth and final raised bed when their shadows fell across my work. "Excuse me," Barbara said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that immediately sets one's teeth on edge. "Are you the property owner?" She clutched her leather portfolio tighter, glancing disapprovingly at the cedar boards and garden tools scattered around my yard. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Yes, I am. Can I help you with something?" I noticed the others in her group, a balding man in an expensive-looking suit, a younger woman frantically taking notes on her tablet, and two other men who seemed to be photographing my property from different angles. "I'm Barbara Whitmore, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association." She paused, clearly expecting some sort of recognition or deference. When I simply nodded, she continued, her lips pursing slightly. "We've received several complaints about the unauthorized construction activity taking place on your property." I blinked, confused. "Unauthorized? These are just raised garden beds. I've checked the city codes. Everything's completely within regulations." I gestured to the neat rows of cedar boxes I'd spent the morning building. The balding man stepped forward, introducing himself as Richard Thompson, HOA Vice President. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, somehow knowing my name without my having provided it, "all exterior modifications in Pine Valley must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before any work begins. This is clearly outlined in the community guidelines." "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake," I replied, feeling the first stirrings of unease. "My property isn't part of the HOA. That was specifically verified during the purchase." I could see Mrs. Chen watching concernedly from her porch, the Patel twins hiding behind their mother's legs as they observed the confrontation. Barbara's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. All properties within Pine Valley Falls are subject to HOA regulations. This project," she gestured vaguely at my garden beds, "violates several of our community standards. The height of these structures exceeds our guidelines, and the proposed greenhouse would be completely unacceptable." I felt my face growing hot. "How do you even know about the greenhouse? It hasn't even arrived yet." The younger woman with the tablet shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "We have our ways of staying informed about neighborhood activities," Barbara replied smoothly. "The point is, this all needs to stop immediately. You'll need to remove what you've already built and submit proper applications for any future modifications. That's not going to happen, I said firmly, my initial confusion giving way to irritation. Again, my property is not part of your HOA. I have the documentation to prove it. I reached for my phone, ready to pull up the relevant emails from my real estate agent. Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering. Listen, Mr. Mitchell, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. The HOA has significant legal resources at our disposal. We've dealt with resistant homeowners before. The threat in his tone was unmistakable. I noticed more neighbors gathering at the edges of their properties, watching the confrontation unfold. The Patels had retreated inside their house entirely, though I could see them peeking through their window blinds. I think you should leave, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. This is private property, and I'm not interested in joining your HOA or following your guidelines. I turned back to my work, hoping they would take the hint. Instead, Barbara pulled out her phone. Very well, we'll be documenting these violations and sending formal notices. Expected them within 24 hours. And Mr. Mitchell? She waited until I looked up again. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position. Things can get very uncomfortable for homeowners who don't cooperate with the association. With that, they turned and left, their group moving with military precision back down my driveway. I watched them go, my hands gripping my garden tools so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The peaceful morning had evaporated, replaced by a heavy sense of foreboding. Mrs. Chen hurried over as soon as they were out of earshot. "Be careful with them," she whispered, glancing nervously in the direction they'd gone. "They made the Hendersons move last year over a painted mailbox." "A mailbox?" She shook her head sadly before retreating back to her porch. I stood there in my half-finished garden, surrounded by the fruits of my morning's labor, feeling like I'd suddenly stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. How could a simple garden project have triggered such an aggressive response? And more importantly, how could they claim authority over my property when I knew for certain I wasn't part of their association? Little did I know, this confrontation was just the opening salvo in what would become a months-long battle for my property rights. The HOA was about to show me just how far they were willing to go to maintain their iron grip on the neighborhood, and I was about to learn exactly what it meant to stand up to them. After the HOA delegation left, I immediately went inside to dig through my closing documents. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my dining room table as I spread out paper after paper, searching for the proof I knew existed. My hands were still dirty from gardening, leaving smudges on the pristine white papers, but I was too focused to care. I found what I was looking for in a folder marked Property Details. There it was, in black and white. Property exempt from Pine Valley HOA jurisdiction due to original lot designation. I took several photos of the document with my phone, then called my real estate agent, Sarah, my fingers drumming impatiently on the table as I waited for her to pick up. "Sarah, we have a situation," I said as soon as she answered. I explained the morning's confrontation, the threats, and my concerns. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's strange," she finally said, her voice carrying a note of worry I hadn't heard before. "I specifically confirmed your property's independent status during closing. Let me pull up the files." I could hear her keyboard clicking in the background. "Give me a few hours to look into this and make some calls. Don't do anything drastic in the meantime." While waiting for Sarah to call back, I decided to do some research of my own. A quick online search revealed dozens of horror stories about HOA overreach, legal battles, and homeowners being forced out of their properties. My stomach tightened as I read account after account of people losing fights against their HOAs, even when they seemed to be in the right. Mrs. Chen appeared at my back door around sunset, carrying a container of soup and a concerned expression. "I brought you dinner," she said, setting it on my kitchen counter. "You should know. The last independent homeowner who fought them didn't fare well." I looked up from my laptop. "What happened?" She settled into one of my kitchen chairs, smoothing her skirt nervously. "The Hendersons. It wasn't just about the mailbox, like I said earlier. They tried to stand up to the HOA about their property's independent status, too. The association harassed them for months. Daily inspections, constant photographs, letters threatening legal action. They even sent people to park outside their house at night, claiming they were security patrols." My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, still working on it. "Found some concerning discrepancies in the property records. Will call tomorrow morning." Mrs. Chen continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The Hendersons finally sold their house at a loss, just to escape. Now Barbara uses their story to keep others in line. She calls it her cautionary tale. Just then a car drove by my house slowly, its occupants clearly taking photos. Mrs. Chen noticed too, shaking her head. It's starting already. They'll document everything, every leaf out of place, every blade of grass that's too long. They'll build a case against you." I stood up, my jaw set. "I'm not the Hendersons. I have proof that my property is independent, and I'm not going to let them bully me out of my home or my rights." "Just be careful," Mrs. Chen warned, standing. "To leave. Barbara has connections with the local police, the city council. She's been running this neighborhood like her personal kingdom for 15 years. Nobody challenges her anymore." After she left, I sat in my darkening kitchen, staring at my half-finished garden through the window. The cedar raised beds gleamed softly in the fading light, a testament to my morning's work and my plans for the future. I couldn't believe this was happening, that a group of self-appointed neighborhood watchdogs thought they could control what I did with my own property. My phone buzzed again, an email this time. My heart sank as I read the subject line. "Notice of violations, immediate action required." The attached document was 5 pages long, listing every supposed violation they documented during their inspection. The raised beds, the planned greenhouse, even the garden bench. Everything was cited as unauthorized and non-compliant. The final paragraph was particularly ominous. "Failure to remedy these violations within 72 hours will result in escalated enforcement actions, including but not limited to fines, liens, and possible legal proceedings." I walked outside, needing some air. The street was quiet now, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. From somewhere in the distance, I heard the distinct sound of a camera shutter clicking. My peaceful corner lot suddenly felt like a battlefield, and I was apparently at war with an enemy I'd never even known existed until this morning. Standing there in my yard, looking at the unfinished project that had sparked this conflict, I made a decision. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to be another cautionary tale for Barbara to use against future homeowners. Tomorrow, I would start gathering evidence, making calls, and preparing for whatever the HOA might throw at me. Little did I know, their next move would make this initial confrontation look like a friendly chat over coffee. The next morning, I woke up to find 3 separate envelopes pushed under my front door. Each one bore the official Pine Valley HOA letterhead, their gold-embossed logo gleaming mockingly in the early morning light. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first one, my coffee growing cold on the counter beside me. "Formal notice of violation and cease and desist order," the heading proclaimed in bold letters. The letter went on to detail what they called egregious violations of community standards, including my unauthorized construction activities and unapproved landscape modifications. The second page included a schedule of fines, $500 per day for each uncorrected violation, starting immediately. The second envelope contained what appeared to be a historical document, a deed restriction from 1975 that supposedly proved all. Properties in Pine Valley Falls were subject to HOA governance. My heart raced as I noticed several inconsistencies with the property documentation I had from closing. The third envelope was the most disturbing. It contained photos of my property, taken at various times throughout the previous day, including some shot well after sunset. They'd been documenting everything from multiple angles, creating a timeline of my violations. There were even photos of my conversations with Mrs. Chen and the Patels, with timestamps and notes about conspiracy to violate HOA regulations. My phone rang. It was Sarah, my real estate agent. "I've been making calls all morning," she said, her voice tense. "Something's not right here. The county records show your property as HOA exempt, but someone filed an amendment last week trying to reverse that status. It's dated after you moved in, but they're claiming it's retroactive." "Can they do that?" I asked, my mouth dry. "Not legally, no, but they're trying, and they have a history of using aggressive tactics while legal challenges play out. Have you received any notices yet?" I glanced at the papers spread across my counter. 3 this morning. They're threatening daily fines and... A sharp knock at my door cut me off. "Hold on, someone's here." Through the peephole I could see a man in what looked like a security uniform. The badge on his chest read, "Pine Valley Community Enforcement." My heart pounding, I opened the door slightly, keeping the security chain engaged. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his tone professionally detached. "I'm Officer Jenkins with Pine Valley Community Enforcement. I'm here to serve you with a formal warning regarding your ongoing violations." He held up another envelope. "I'm not part of your HOA," I stated firmly, "and I don't recognize your authority to—" "Sir," he interrupted, "failure to accept this notice will be documented as an additional violation. You currently have 48 hours to remove all unauthorized structures and restore your property to its approved condition. After that, we will be forced to take more serious action." "What kind of action?" I asked, even as I accepted the envelope through the gap in the door. His face remained impassive. "The HOA board has authorized escalated enforcement measures, including possible property liens, forced remediation, and legal proceedings. We also maintain close relationships with local law enforcement regarding trespassing and property violations." The threat was clear. They were preparing to bring in the real police if I didn't comply. As if to emphasize this point, a patrol car from the actual police department drove by slowly, the officer inside giving me a long look before continuing down the street. "Have a good day, Mr. Mitchell," the HOA officer said, turning to leave. "Remember 48 hours?" I closed the door and leaned against it, my hands shaking as I opened the new envelope. This notice was even more detailed than the others, including specific citations from their community guidelines and references to local ordinances. They were building a legal case, document by document, preparing for what looked like all-out war over my garden project. Sarah was still on the phone. Still there. What happened? I described the encounter with the HOA officer and the new notice. She was quiet for a moment. "Listen," she finally said. "I think you need to talk to a lawyer. Today. This is moving faster than I expected, and they're playing hardball. I know someone who specializes in property law and HOA disputes. Let me make a call." As I hung up, I noticed another car driving slowly past my house, its occupants clearly taking more photos. The peaceful neighborhood I'd fallen in love with was starting to feel like a prison, with every window potentially hiding someone documenting my every move. The HOA had just shown their hand. They were willing to use every tool at their disposal, including intimidation, surveillance, and the threat of legal action, to force me into compliance. They'd given me 48 hours to destroy everything I'd built, to give up my dreams for this property, and to submit to their authority. They clearly expected me to fold under the pressure, to become another cautionary tale like the Hendersons. But as I looked out at my half-finished garden, at the raised beds I'd built with my own hands, I knew I couldn't just give up. I had 48 hours to prepare for whatever came next, and I intended to use every minute of it. The 2 days that followed were a blur of activity. I'd barely finished scanning and organizing all their threatening notices when another stack appeared under my door. These ones were even more aggressive, filled with legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. One particularly concerning letter detailed their right to enter the property and remove non-compliant structures, with the costs being forcibly charged to my account. But what really set me off was their response to my simple act of pushing back. When I'd taped my property exemption documents to my front window, hoping to show them their claims were baseless, they'd retaliated immediately. Within hours, I received a new violation notice for unauthorized window displays, along with a $250 fine. The pettiness of it was almost comical if it hadn't been so infuriating. The final straw came when I found a formal notice stapled directly to one of my newly built cedar-raised beds. The staples had been driven deep into the wood, leaving ugly gouges in the carefully finished surface. The notice itself was printed in bold red letters. Unauthorized structure, scheduled for removal. I lost it. After spending the morning carefully, documenting every notice, every photo they'd taken, every interaction with their officers, I'd had enough. I stormed out my front door, notice in hand, ready to confront whoever was responsible. As if on cue, I spotted Barbara Whitmore herself standing at the end of my driveway, tablet in hand, presumably documenting more violations. "Hey!" I called, out, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "You can't just damage my property like this." I held up the stapled notice, my hands shaking with anger. Barbara's expression didn't change as she raised her tablet, apparently recording our interaction. "Any damage occurred during official HOA enforcement actions is the responsibility of the non-compliant homeowner," she recited, as if reading from a script. "This is ridiculous," I said, ripping the notice off the raised bed. "I have proof that my property is exempt from your HOA. You can't just—" "Mr. Mitchell," she interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension, "your continued defiance is being documented. The board has already approved escalated enforcement measures. I suggest you comply before things become unpleasant." That's when I did something that probably wasn't wise. I crumpled up their notice and tossed it onto my own driveway. "Get off my property," I said firmly. "You're trespassing." Barbara's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained fixed. "Very well. You've made your position clear." She spoke into her phone. "Please note, subject has displayed aggressive behavior and destroyed official HOA documentation. Timestamp 2:47 p.m. As she walked away, I noticed several neighbors quickly retreating into their houses. Only Mrs. Chen remained on her porch, shaking her head slowly. "They'll use that against you," she called softly. "They always document everything." She was right. Within an hour, a police car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers approached, my door looking serious. When I answered, they explained they'd received a complaint about threatening behavior and destruction of official documents. "Are you kidding me?" I asked in disbelief. "They're the ones harassing me. Look at what they did to my garden bed." I showed them the gouges from the staples. The officers exchanged glances. "Sir," the older one said, "we recommend you handle any HOA disputes through proper legal channels. We don't want to have to come back out here." After they left, I sat on my front steps, head in my hands. The HOA had just demonstrated their power. They could not only damage my property, but could also manipulate law enforcement to paint me as the aggressor. Their strategy was becoming clear. Document everything, escalate continuously, and use every resource at their disposal to wear me down. My phone buzzed. Another email from the HOA board. This one announced an emergency meeting to discuss recent incidents of homeowner non-compliance and aggressive behavior. They were building their case, piece by piece, turning my simple act of defiance into something that sounded almost criminal. Looking at my damaged garden bed, I realized this was just the beginning. They weren't going to back down, and every action I took would be twisted and used against me. The peaceful garden project I'd dreamed of had become ground zero in a neighborhood war, and I was seriously outgunned. But as I sat there, watching another HOA security car drive by slowly, I made a decision. If they wanted to document everything, I could play that game too. I went inside and ordered security cameras for every corner of my property. Two could play at this documentation game. What I didn't realize then was that this small act of defiance, crumpling up their notice and telling Barbara to leave, would be used as the justification for their most aggressive move yet. The HOA was about to show me just how far they were willing to go to maintain control of their precious neighborhood. I knew I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. After the confrontation with Barbara and the police visit, I spent hours poring over every document related to my property purchase. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of papers, deed records, closing documents, property surveys, and local ordinances. Empty coffee cups littered the space as I dug deeper into the history of Pine Valley Falls. Sarah, my real estate agent, had come through with contact information for a property lawyer, but before I made that call, I wanted to arm myself with as much information as possible. Something about the HOA's claims didn't add up, and I was determined to find out what it was. The deeper I dug, the more interesting things got. The original development plans from 1975 showed that my corner lot, along with a few others on the periphery of the neighborhood, had indeed been designated as independent properties. These lots were specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction because they were part of an older development that predated Pine Valley Falls. But then I found something odd. There were two different versions of the property maps in my files. One from my closing documents showing my lot as independent, and another seemingly older one showing it as part of the HOA. The dates on both documents looked authentic, but they couldn't both be right. I called the county records office, hoping to get some clarification. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone who could help. "Let me pull up those records," the clerk said. I could hear her keyboard clicking in the background. "That's strange." "What's strange?" I asked, my heart racing. "Well, according to our records, your property's status was changed multiple times over the years. There are several amendments filed, some contradicting others. The most recent one was just filed last week. An attempt to retroactively include your lot in the HOA jurisdiction." I scribbled notes frantically as she continued, "But here's the interesting part. Some of these documents appear to have irregularities. The signatures don't quite match across all versions, and the notary stamps. I'd need to verify these in person." This was the first real lead I'd found. If there were irregularities in the documents, maybe the HOA's claim to authority over my property wasn't as solid as they wanted everyone to believe. I decided to dig even deeper. Using my software development skills, I created a spreadsheet to track every change to my property's status over the years. A pattern began to emerge. Every time a homeowner had challenged the HOA's authority, new documents would mysteriously appear, attempting to reinforce the HOA's control. Mrs. Chen proved to be an unexpected source of historical information. She'd lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had witnessed many of these changes firsthand. Over another batch of her dumplings, she shared what she knew. The original developer never intended for these corner lots to be part of the HOA, she explained, her voice low as if sharing a secret. But when Barbara became board president 15 years ago, things changed. She started what she called community unification, trying to bring every property under HOA control. She told me about other homeowners who had tried to maintain their independence. The Hendersons weren't the first to be driven out. There was a pattern: sudden document discoveries, escalating harassment, and eventually the homeowners would give up and sell. Armed with this information, I made an appointment at the county records office to examine the original documents in person. What I found was shocking. Several of the amendments affecting my property had different versions on file, with subtle but significant differences. Some had signs of alteration, dates that didn't quite align, signature pages that appeared to have been copied from other documents. I took detailed photos of everything, careful to document every inconsistency. As I was leaving the records office, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Found something important. Previous owner of your house filed complaint about HOA document manipulation. Case never went to court. He sold before it could proceed. Have copies of his evidence. When can you meet?" The pieces were starting to come together. The HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood wasn't just about maintaining property values or community standards. It was about power, control, and maybe something more. The questionable documents, the pattern of harassment, the sudden appearance of new amendments whenever someone challenged their authority. It all pointed to a systematic effort to expand their control through any means necessary. But knowledge is power, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some. The HOA might have their surveillance, their threats, and their army of officers, but I had something they didn't expect: evidence of their manipulation and a growing understanding of how they operated. What I didn't know yet was that my investigation had not gone unnoticed. Even as I was uncovering their secrets, the HOA was preparing their most aggressive move yet, one that would make their previous harassment seem tame in comparison. Armed with my findings, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting. It was being held at the community center, a pristine building that seemed to embody everything the HOA stood for. Perfectly maintained, rigidly controlled, and somehow slightly intimidating. As I walked in, I noticed security cameras tracking my movement and 2 HOA officers stationed at the entrance. The meeting room was packed, but an unnatural hush fell over the crowd as I entered. Neighbors I'd previously chatted with casually now avoided eye contact. The Patels, seated near the back, gave me a subtle, sympathetic nod. Mrs. Chen wasn't there. She'd warned me earlier that she couldn't be seen supporting me openly, but had slipped me a note with details about previous homeowners who'd fought the HOA. Barbara Whitmore sat at the center of the board table, flanked by Richard Thompson and 3 other board members. The table was elevated on a small platform, forcing everyone to quite literally look up to them. A projector displayed the meeting agenda, and I noticed with a twist in my stomach that enforcement actions, 1242 Oak Corner, my address, was listed under urgent business. I took a seat in the back row, my folder of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. The meeting began with the usual formalities: budget reports, maintenance schedules, and approvals for paint colors. Throughout it all, I could feel eyes occasionally, darting in my direction, measuring my reactions. Finally, Barbara reached my item on the agenda. A photo of my property appeared on the screen, my half-finished garden project labeled with red circles indicating violations. "Now, we need to address the ongoing situation at 1242 Oak Corner," Barbara announced, her voice carrying that same condescending tone I'd come to know well. "Mr. Mitchell has repeatedly refused to comply with community standards and has displayed increasingly confrontational behavior." Richard stepped in, clicking through more photos, including shots of my confrontation with Barbara, carefully edited to make me appear aggressive. "We've attempted to work with the homeowner, but he continues to deny our authority despite clear documentation. That was my cue. I stood up, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. I'd like to address these claims. Barbara's smile didn't reach her eyes. This is not a forum for disputes. If you wish to contest violations, you need to submit a formal appeal. I have evidence, I interrupted, holding up my folder, that documents filed regarding my property's HOA status have been altered. Multiple versions exist in county records, with inconsistent signatures and dates. A murmur ran through the crowd. Barbara's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Mr. Mitchell, if you have concerns about documentation, you should raise them through proper channels, like the channels the Hendersons tried to use, I asked, turning to face the crowd. Or the previous owner of my house, whose complaint about document manipulation mysteriously disappeared when he was forced to sell. The room erupted in whispers. I noticed several homeowners leaning forward, suddenly very interested. Barbara rapped her gavel sharply. This is not the appropriate venue for unfounded accusations, she snapped. Security, please escort Mr. Mitchell out if he continues to disrupt the meeting. But I wasn't finished. I've spoken with the county records office. They've noted irregularities in multiple HOA amendments, particularly ones filed just after homeowners challenged the association's authority. I'm sure many of you have similar stories. That's enough, Barbara's voice cracked like a whip. She nodded to the security officers, who started moving in my direction. This meeting will not be hijacked by conspiracy theories and baseless allegations. As the officers approached, I saw something unexpected. Several homeowners standing up, moving to form a barrier between me and security. The Patels were among them, along with a few others I recognized as owners of supposedly independent properties. Let him speak, someone called from the crowd. We have a right to know. Barbara's face had turned an interesting shade of red. This meeting is adjourned, she declared, gathering her papers quickly. Anyone remaining in this room will be considered in violation of community guidelines regarding unauthorized gatherings. As the board members hurried out, I found myself surrounded by neighbors, many speaking at once, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach and questionable documentation. The seed of doubt had been planted, and for the first time, cracks were showing in the HOA's carefully maintained facade of authority. What I didn't realize was that by publicly challenging them, I'd forced their hand. The HOA couldn't allow this kind of defiance to go unchecked. Their response would come swiftly, and it would show everyone in Pine Valley Falls exactly what happened to those who dared to question their authority. But for that moment, standing in the community center surrounded by neighbors who were finally willing to speak up, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was coming out, and the HOA's carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to shake. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and severe. The next morning, I woke up to find my entire property had been plastered with violation. Notices, not just on my door, but stapled to every raised garden bed, attached to my mailbox, and even taped to my car windshield. Each notice cited different violations, with fines now totaling over $10,000, but they didn't stop there. A line of 3 HOA security vehicles parked across the street, their occupants photographing everyone who approached my house. When Mrs. Jen tried to bring over her usual morning coffee, they intercepted her, warning her about associating with non-compliant residents. The Patels found similar notices on their property, citing vague violations about unauthorized gatherings and promoting community discord. Other neighbors who had stood up for me at the meeting received warnings about conspiracy to undermine community standards. Richard Thompson appeared at my door personally, flanked by 2 security officers. The board has convened an emergency session, he announced, his voice carrying deliberately so neighbors could hear. Given your disruptive behavior and continued defiance, we're implementing immediate sanctions. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a notice of lien against my property for unpaid fines, along with a cease and desist order demanding I remove not just the garden beds, but also all documentation related to HOA matters from my possession. "You've forced our hand, Mr. Mitchell," Richard said, his tone almost regretful. "We cannot allow one resident to destabilize our entire community structure. You have 24 hours to comply, or we'll be forced to take more decisive action." My lawyer, whom I'd finally hired after the meeting, called in a panic. "They're moving faster than I expected," she warned. "They've filed emergency injunctions against you in 3 different courts. They're painting you as a threat to community safety, citing your aggressive behavior at the meeting." The intimidation campaign intensified throughout the day. HOA officers began stopping delivery drivers, claiming they needed special permits to approach my house. When I tried to leave for groceries, they followed my car all the way to the store, photographing every move. By evening, someone had posted large signs at both ends of my street, warning active HOA enforcement zone. Unauthorized activities will be documented. My security cameras caught HOA officers placing these signs, but when I tried to remove them, they threatened to call the police for vandalism. The final blow came at midnight. I was awakened by bright floodlights shining directly into my bedroom. Windows. The HOA had installed security lighting on the street poles, aimed specifically at my property. When I called the police to complain about the harassment, they said it was a civil matter and refused to intervene. Mrs. Chen managed to sneak over under cover of darkness. "They're trying to make an example of you," she whispered. "Barbara's telling everyone this is what happens when people question the HOA's authority. Some neighbors are already talking about selling their homes." What had started as a simple garden project had escalated into psychological warfare. The HOA was using every tool at their disposal to isolate me, intimidate my supporters, and show the entire neighborhood the cost of defiance. But their heavy-handed response had revealed something crucial. They were scared. My evidence of their document manipulation had struck a nerve, and they were desperate to silence me before others started asking questions. As I sat in my artificially illuminated house that night, watching HOA security vehicles circle my property like sharks, I realized this was their biggest mistake. Their excessive reaction was proving everything I'd said about their abuse of power. The question was, could I hold out long enough to expose the truth, or would they succeed in forcing me out like all the others before me? The next escalation from the HOA came in the form of actual law enforcement. At 6 a.m., 3 police cars pulled up outside my house, lights flashing. Through my security cameras, I watched Barbara Whitmore emerge from her car, speaking animatedly with the officers. While gesturing at my property, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see 2 officers standing on my porch, looking grim. Barbara and Richard Thompson hovered behind them, barely containing their smug expressions. "Mr. Mitchell," one officer called out, "we have reports of unauthorized construction and potential code violations. We need you to open the door." My hands shook as I called my lawyer. "Don't open the door," she instructed firmly. "I'm on my way. They need a warrant for this kind of inspection." When I relayed this through the door, Barbara's voice rang out, "He's being uncooperative again. This is exactly the kind of behavior we've been documenting." The officers exchanged glances. "Sir, we can get a warrant, but that will only make things more complicated. We're just here to verify compliance with city building codes." My security cameras caught HOA board members directing a group of contractors toward my garden beds. They carried measuring tapes and clipboards, clearly ready to document every possible violation they could find. "This is private property," called through the door. "Unless you have a warrant, you're all trespassing." "Mr. Mitchell," Barbara's voice dripped with satisfaction. "As HOA president, I have the authority to authorize property inspections. Your continued obstruction only proves your guilt. The standoff lasted for 2 hours. My lawyer arrived just as the police were receiving their warrant. She quickly reviewed it, pointing out several irregularities in the documentation. This warrant was obtained under false pretenses, she argued with the officers. The HOA provided misleading information about their jurisdiction over this property. We have evidence of document manipulation that calls their authority into question. But the HOA had planned this carefully. They'd brought a city building inspector with them, shifting the issue from HOA jurisdiction to city code compliance. Even my lawyer couldn't prevent them from accessing the property under those circumstances. What followed was excruciating. For 3 hours, they measured every inch of my garden project, photographed everything, and wrote countless citations. The HOA board members followed behind, adding their own violations to their ever-growing list. Each raised bed exceeds permitted height by 2 inches, Barbara announced triumphantly. That's a separate violation for each structure. The building inspector seemed uncomfortable with the HOA's obvious glee, but he had to do his job. There are some minor issues, he admitted, but nothing that can't be easily corrected. That wasn't good enough for Barbara. We'll be adding these code violations to our existing complaints, she declared. The total fines now exceed $15,000 and they'll continue to accrue daily until all structures are removed. My lawyer documented everything, paying special attention to the HOA's behavior. They're overplaying their hand, she whispered to me. This kind of harassment, using law enforcement to intimidate a resident, it's going to help our case. But as everyone finally left my property, I felt defeated. The HOA had managed to turn a simple garden project into a criminal matter. They'd brought the police to my door and forced their way onto my property. Worse, they'd shown every neighbor watching from their windows exactly what happened to people who challenged their authority. Mrs. Chen managed to catch my eye from her porch. She held up a small sign she'd written, "Don't give up. Others are watching." She was right. This wasn't just about my garden anymore. It was about standing up to systemic abuse of power. As I surveyed my now thoroughly documented property, I realized the HOA had just made their biggest mistake yet. They'd crossed a line, using law enforcement as a weapon in their campaign of intimidation. But in doing so, they'd given us exactly the kind of evidence we needed to prove their pattern of harassment. The question was, could I withstand whatever they planned next? My lawyer's office was on the 12th floor of a downtown building, the kind of place that spoke of serious legal muscle. Lisa Martinez had come highly recommended by Sarah, and I could see why. Her desk was covered with HOA cases, and her walls displayed numerous victories against similar organizations. "They've overplayed their hand," she said, reviewing the footage from my security cameras, using law enforcement to intimidate a resident, falsifying inspection reports, selective enforcement. It's all documented now. But here's what really interests me. She pulled out a stack of papers. These are the original property documents I requested from the county archives. She spread them across her desk, pointing out discrepancies I hadn't even noticed. "See these? Notary stamps. The dates don't match the filing dates, and these signatures, they're photocopied from other documents. Someone's been manipulating official records, and they didn't do a very good job covering their tracks." "Can we prove it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Better than that," she smiled. "I've found 3 other homeowners from Pine Valley Falls who filed similar complaints over the past 5 years. All of them were forced out before their cases could proceed, but their evidence is still on record. We're building a pattern." She pulled up more documents on her computer. "The HOA's legal authority rests on these amended documents, but if we can prove they're fraudulent..." She let the implication hang in the air. "What about the fines they're trying to impose?" "Unenforceable if they can't prove jurisdiction," she explained. "But here's where it gets interesting. I've been doing some digging into Pine Valley's finances. The HOA has been using these fines to build quite a war chest. They've collected hundreds of thousands of dollars from homeowners through questionable enforcement actions. She showed me spreadsheets detailing the HOA's financial records. They're using the money to fund their legal battles, but they're also paying for consulting services from companies owned by board members. Barbara Whitmore's private security firm, for example, gets paid handsomely for providing those officers who've been harassing you. The pieces were starting to fit together. This wasn't just about control, it was about money. The HOA had created a perfect system for extracting funds from homeowners through intimidation and selective enforcement. "So what's our next move?" I asked. Lisa leaned back in her chair. "We file a comprehensive lawsuit, not just challenging their jurisdiction over your property, but alleging fraud, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds. We'll depose every board member, subpoena all their records, and demand a full audit of their finances." She pulled out another document. "But first, we file this, an emergency injunction to stop their enforcement actions while the case proceeds. They can't keep harassing you or adding fines while their authority is being challenged in court." As she explained the legal strategy, I felt hope rising for the first time in weeks. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. We were going on the offensive, challenging the very foundation of the HOA's power. "There's one more thing," Lisa added, her expression serious. "Once we file, they're going to come at you hard. They can't afford to let this case proceed. It would expose too much. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my half-finished garden, about Mrs. Chen's quiet support, about the other neighbors watching and waiting to see if someone could finally stand up to the HOA's tyranny. "I'm ready," I said firmly. "What do we do first?" Lisa handed me a thick stack of papers to sign. "We file these first thing tomorrow morning. But tonight, go home and document everything. Every interaction, every notice, every photo they've taken. We're going to need it all." As I left her office, I felt both energized and apprehensive. We had a plan now, and solid evidence to back it up. But I also knew the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight. They had too much to lose. Walking to my car, I received a text from Mrs. Chen. "Barbara and Richard just called another emergency board meeting. Something big is coming." I showed the message to Lisa, who was walking me out. She nodded grimly. "They'll try to act before we can file. Go home and be careful. Don't engage with them no matter what they do. Everything they try now will just add to our case." What I didn't know then was that the HOA was about to launch their most aggressive attack yet. One that would test not just my resolve, but the entire neighborhood's willingness to stand up against their reign of terror. The HOA's pressure campaign reached new heights following their emergency board meeting. I woke up to find not just one or two security vehicles, but a full line of them parked along my street. Each one was marked with Pine Valley Community Enforcement in bold letters, their lights flashing ominously in the early morning light. Every time I looked out my window, someone was taking photos or making notes. They'd set up a folding table right at the edge of my property, where HOA officers took shifts documenting every movement. When my Amazon delivery driver tried to approach, they intercepted him, demanding to see his community access credentials. The psychological warfare was relentless. They installed additional floodlights, now illuminating every corner of my property 24/7. The constant buzz of the lights was maddening, and sleep became nearly impossible. Every few hours, an officer would approach my door with new violation. Notices, each one more absurd than the last. Violation, unauthorized window cleaning schedule. Violation, non-compliant grass blade length variance. Violation, improper mail retrieval timing. The fines were mounting by thousands each day. They'd even started citing me for emotional distress to community members, caused by my continued defiance of community standards. Mrs. Chen tried to bring me groceries, but they stopped her car at the entrance to my street. Community members are prohibited from providing support to non-compliant residents, they told her. When she protested, they took photos of her license plate and threatened to fine her for interfering with enforcement actions. The Patels found their children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk labeled as vandalism by HOA inspectors. Other supportive neighbors received notices about their own properties. Suddenly, everyone who had shown me any kindness was finding themselves under intense scrutiny. Barbara Whitmore seemed to be orchestrating it all from her SUV, parked strategically. At the corner where she could observe everything, I caught glimpses of her speaking into her phone, directing her officers like a general commanding troops. The surveillance became so intense that I had to set up my work laptop in my bathroom, the only place their cameras couldn't peer into. Even then, they logged every time I left the room, documenting my suspicious behavior patterns. My security cameras captured it all. Officers measuring the height of individual blades of grass, photographing the angle of my garden hose, even documenting the pattern of birds landing in my yard as unauthorized wildlife encouragement. One particularly zealous officer spent an entire afternoon using a protractor to measure the exact angle of my mailbox flag. When it was found to be 3 degrees off from HOA specifications, I received another $500 fine. The most surreal moment came when they brought in a certified plant auditor. Apparently such a thing existed in their world, to inspect every leaf in my yard. She spent hours cataloging my vegetation, eventually producing a 27-page report citing non-regulation chlorophyll levels and unapproved photosynthesis patterns. My lawyer called regularly, documenting each new harassment incident for our case. "They're getting desperate," she said. "This level of surveillance is way beyond reasonable HOA oversight. Keep your cameras running. They're giving us exactly the evidence we need." But the constant pressure was taking its toll. Simple tasks like checking my mail or taking out trash became nerve-wracking ordeals, knowing every move was being photographed and documented. The HOA officers had started narrating my actions into their radios, making sure I could hear them. Subject is approaching mailbox. Subject appears to be collecting mail in a non-approved manner. Subject's mail retrieval angle indicates potential resistance to community standards. The psychological effect of constant surveillance was exhausting. Even inside my own home, I felt watched, documented, judged. The HOA had effectively turned my peaceful corner lot into a fishbowl, with Barbara and her minions taking shifts to ensure not a single moment went unobserved. Late one night, unable to sleep under the glare of their floodlights, I received a text from an unknown number. "Not everyone on the board agrees with this. Some of us want to help. Meeting tomorrow behind the community center, 3 p.m. I stared at the message for a long time, wondering if it was genuine or just another HOA trap. Either way, it was clear their campaign of harassment was starting to crack something, either my resolve or their own unity. The question was, which would break first? That morning, a certified letter arrived that made my blood run cold. The HOA had escalated their tactics to a shocking new level. They were attempting to have me declared a clear and present danger to the community. The letter contained a formal notification of their intent to seek an emergency court order for my removal from the property. Due to increasing concerns about the destabilizing effect of your continued presence in Pine Valley Falls, the letter read, the board has determined that immediate action is necessary to preserve community safety and property values. Attached was a detailed list of my dangerous behaviors, including such absurd items as displaying signs of mental instability through obsessive gardening activities and exhibiting aggressive tendencies in document handling. They'd even included screenshots from their surveillance, showing me violently crumpling their notices and menacingly operating gardening tools. I immediately scanned everything and sent it to my lawyer. Her response was immediate. "This is unprecedented. They're trying to paint you as mentally unstable to justify forced removal. Do not leave your house until I get there." But the HOA wasn't waiting. Within an hour, a team of mental health compliance officers, wearing uniforms that looked suspiciously similar to their regular security officers, arrived at my property. They began setting up a perimeter complete with yellow, caution tape and warning signs about unstable resident containment zone. Barbara Whitmore appeared with a megaphone. "Mr. Mitchell," her voice boomed across the neighborhood, "for your own safety and the safety of the community, we demand you surrender yourself for psychological evaluation. Your continued resistance to community standards indicates severe antisocial tendencies." My phone started ringing non-stop. Concerned neighbors, my family, even local news outlets who'd somehow gotten wind of the situation. The HOA had managed to turn my simple garden dispute into a full-blown mental health crisis. Through my security cameras, I watched in disbelief as they brought in what appeared to be a crisis negotiation team, all wearing Pine Valley HOA badges. They set up a command center in a neighbor's driveway, complete with blueprints of my house and a whiteboard listing subjects' known triggers, including rational discussions about property rights and factual documentation. Mrs. Chen managed to text me. "They're telling everyone you've had a mental breakdown. Barbara's saying your obsession with fighting the HOA is proof of dangerous instability. Don't let them in." The situation reached peak absurdity when they brought in a forensic landscaping psychologist who began analyzing my garden beds for signs of disturbed thinking patterns. He spent hours measuring the spacing between plants, declaring that the irregular intervals indicate severe cognitive disruption. My lawyer arrived just as they were attempting to declare my entire property a mental health quarantine zone. She immediately began documenting everything, her face growing increasingly incredulous. "This is beyond harassment," she said, taking photos of their crisis command center. "They're actually trying to have you committed because you won't submit to their authority. This is the most egregious abuse of power I've ever seen." The final straw came when Barbara announced over the megaphone that they were prepared to use necessary force to ensure my psychological compliance with community standards. They had crossed a line from harassment into something far more sinister. My lawyer immediately got on the phone with the real police and the local media. "They're attempting to perform an illegal psychiatric detention," she explained. "This isn't just HOA overreach anymore. It's false imprisonment and defamation." As reporters began arriving, drawn by the spectacle of HOA officers in mock SWAT gear surrounding a house over garden beds, Barbara quickly tried to dismantle their command center. But it was too late. Their outrageous attempt to paint me as mentally ill for opposing their authority had been captured on dozens of cameras. This was their biggest mistake yet. In their desperate attempt to force me out, they'd exposed themselves as something far more dangerous than just overzealous property managers. They'd shown everyone watching that they were willing to destroy someone's reputation, their credibility, and potentially their freedom, all to maintain their grip on power. The question now wasn't just whether I could stand up to their harassment, but whether any of us were safe, as long as this HOA remained in control. The battle had shifted from defending my garden to exposing a system that had completely lost touch with reality in its quest for absolute control. With the HOA's attempt to have me declared mentally unstable making headlines, my lawyer knew it was time to launch our counteroffensive. We gathered in her office late that night, surrounded by mountains of evidence, surveillance footage, violation notices, financial records, and testimonies from other residents who'd been similarly harassed. "We're filing first thing tomorrow." "Morning?" Lisa explained, sorting through documents. "Not just the injunction to stop their harassment, but a comprehensive federal lawsuit. We're alleging civil rights violations, fraud, harassment, abuse of power, and misuse of HOA funds. But here's the key. We're filing it as a class action." "Class action?" I asked, looking up from the stack of papers I was signing. "Yes. Over. The past week, I've been contacted by 15 other Pine Valley residents who faced similar harassment, plus 3 former homeowners who were forced out. They're all willing to join the suit." She smiled grimly. The HOA's latest stunt with the fake mental health crisis pushed many people over the edge. They're ready to fight back. We worked through the night, preparing everything. The lawsuit detailed every incident, from the initial confrontation over my garden to their latest attempt to have me forcibly removed. But it went deeper, exposing the pattern of document manipulation, selective enforcement, and financial irregularities that had allowed them to maintain control for so long. "The really interesting part," Lisa said, pulling up financial records on her computer, "is where the money's been going. We've traced the payments to their security firm. It's a shell company owned by Barbara's husband. The community improvement contracts all go to companies connected to board members. They've been using HOA fees and fines to enrich themselves. For years, by sunrise, we had everything ready. The lawsuit painted a damning picture of corruption, abuse, and organized harassment. But we weren't just seeking damages. We were asking the court to dissolve the HOA entirely and place all their records under judicial review. Once we file this, they're going to react badly," Lisa warned. "They'll try everything to stop it from proceeding." "Are you ready for that?" I thought about my ruined garden, the sleepless nights under their floodlights, the neighbors who'd been intimidated for showing me support. "More than ready." We filed the lawsuit at 9 a.m. sharp. By 9:30, the HOA's lawyers were already calling, demanding we withdraw it. By 10 a.m., Barbara had convened another emergency board meeting. Through our network of sympathetic neighbors, we learned they were planning something big. "They're in panic mode," reported one insider via encrypted message. "Barbara's ordering all records moved off-site. They're shredding documents in the community center. My lawyer immediately filed for an emergency preservation order to protect the evidence." As we left the courthouse, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Go home and be careful. The next 24 hours are crucial. They're going to try something desperate before these orders take effect." She was right. When I got home, I found a notice taped to my door that chilled me to the bone. The HOA was claiming emergency powers under a never-before-used bylaw. They were declaring my property a community safety hazard and announcing their intention to take direct control of it. Through my security cameras, I watched as Barbara and her team huddled at the end of my driveway, pointing at my house and gesturing animatedly. They were planning something, and I had a feeling I wouldn't have to wait long to find out what. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "They're calling in contractors, big trucks heading your way. Whatever they're planning, it's happening. Soon." I called my lawyer immediately. "They're not going to wait for the courts," I said, watching more vehicles arrive. "They're going to try something now." "Stay inside," she instructed. "Document everything. I'm calling the police and heading your way. Whatever happens, don't give them any excuse to claim you're being aggressive." As the sun set, I watched through my cameras as they assembled their force, HOA security vehicles, contractors with equipment, and what looked like a demolition crew. Barbara stood at the center of it all, issuing orders and pointing at different parts of my property. They were preparing for their final assault, and it was clear they didn't intend to let little things like laws or court orders stand in their way. The question was, Could we stop them before they destroyed everything I'd fought so hard to protect? At dawn, the confrontation I'd been dreading finally arrived. A convoy of vehicles pulled up outside my house, 3 HOA security cars, 2 contractor vans, and a large truck with demolition equipment. Barbara Whitmore stood at the head of her makeshift army, megaphone in hand, looking more like a military commander than a neighborhood administrator. "Mr. Mitchell," her voice boomed across the morning quiet, "by emergency authority of the Pine Valley HOA Board, we are proceeding with immediate remediation of your property violations. You have 10 minutes to exit the premises." I was ready. For them. My security cameras were recording everything, live streaming directly to my lawyer's office. I had multiple neighbors secretly filming from their windows. Even the local news had been tipped off, with reporters already setting up across the street. "This property is under federal court protection," I called back through my own speaker system, a recent installation my lawyer had recommended. "Any attempt to enter or modify the property will constitute a violation of standing court orders." Barbara's face twisted with rage. "We have community authority that supersedes any temporary court orders. This is a matter of neighborhood safety and property values. Proceed with the operation." The contractors looked uncertain, glancing between Barbara and my house. One of them was reading the court order I'd prominently displayed in my front window, clearly having second thoughts. That's when my lawyer arrived, tires screeching as she pulled up. She jumped out of her car, tablet in hand. "Every person here needs to understand something," she announced, her voice carrying across the tense scene. "We just received an emergency injunction from the federal court. Anyone participating in this action will be personally liable for contempt charges." She held up her tablet displaying the court order. "That includes contractors, security personnel, and board members. Federal marshals are already on their way." The effect was immediate. Several contractors started backing away, returning to their vehicles. The demolition crew began packing up their equipment. Barbara's carefully organized assault was crumbling before her eyes. "You don't have the authority," Barbara started, but my lawyer cut her off. "Actually, we have documented evidence of fraud, financial misconduct, and civil rights violations. Would you like me to detail them for the news cameras?" She gestured to the growing media presence. That's when something unexpected happened. Richard Thompson, the HOA vice president, stepped forward. "Barbara, this has gone too far. We need to stop." Barbara whirled on him. "We can't let them destroy everything we've built. The control, the system." "The system you built to enrich yourself?" Richard shot back. "Yes, I know about the shell companies, the fake contracts. We all know now." Other board members were backing away from Barbara, creating a visible divide. Years of absolute control were unraveling in minutes. More neighbors were emerging from their homes now, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen stood proudly on her porch, filming everything. The Patels had brought out chairs, making it clear they were there to witness whatever happened next. "This is your last chance," my lawyer announced. "Everyone involved in this illegal action needs to leave now or face the consequences when the federal marshals arrive." The security officers were the first to break ranks, pulling away in their vehicles. The remaining contractors quickly followed. Soon, only Barbara and a few die-hard board members remained. "You don't understand what you're destroying," Barbara said, her voice cracking. "Without strict control, this neighborhood will descend into chaos. Property values will plummet. "Everything I've worked for, you mean everything you've stolen," called out a voice from the crowd. Other neighbors joined in, years of pent-up frustration finally boiling over. As federal marshals' vehicles appeared at the end of the street, Barbara finally admitted defeat. But as she walked to her car, she turned back for one last threat. "This isn't over. You have no idea what you've done to this community." She was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But the community she'd ruled through fear and intimidation was already changing. Neighbors were talking openly, sharing their stories of HOA abuse. The wall of fear she'd built was crumbling, and something new was taking its place. What none of us realized then was that this confrontation would become a turning point, not just for Pine Valley Falls, but for HOA reform across the entire state. The battle wasn't over, but the balance of power had finally shifted. With Barbara's final threat still hanging in the air, the real work began. The federal marshals immediately started securing HOA records, placing crime scene tape around the community center where just hours earlier, board members had been frantically shredding documents. Inside the building, investigators discovered the true extent of the HOA's deception. Filing cabinets were stuffed with altered documents, each telling a story of systematic fraud. My lawyer had set up a command center in a conference room, coordinating with forensic accountants who were piecing together years of financial manipulation. "Look at this," one accountant called out, holding up a stack of invoices. Every major contract went through shell companies. Landscaping, security, maintenance, all flowing back to board members or their families. They've been bleeding this community dry for years. The evidence was staggering. We found multiple versions of property documents, each altered to expand HOA control. Bank statements revealed a complex web of accounts used to hide the true destination of homeowner fees and fines. There were even detailed dossiers on every resident who had ever challenged their authority, including surveillance photos and personal information. My lawyer worked methodically, building our case piece by piece. "This goes beyond simple HOA overreach," she explained as we reviewed the findings. "We're looking at mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and possible RICO violations. They weren't just controlling the neighborhood, they were running a criminal enterprise." Former board members, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began coming forward with their own evidence. Richard Thompson, the vice president who had turned on Barbara, provided years of email correspondence documenting their systematic harassment of homeowners. "It was all about control and money," he testified in a sworn statement. Barbara had a playbook. First, find a minor violation or create one. Then escalate with fines and harassment until the homeowner either submitted or sold their property at a loss. They even had preferred buyers lined up, usually friends or family members of board members. The investigation spread beyond Pine Valley Falls. Other HOAs in the region had similar patterns of abuse, many linked to consulting firms owned by Barbara or her associates. She had been exporting her model of control and exploitation across the state. Mrs. Chen organized a community meeting in her backyard, away from the now sealed community center. Dozens of neighbors shared their stories of intimidation and financial hardship. The Patels described how they'd been forced to pay thousands in fines for unauthorized cultural decorations during Diwali. An elderly resident broke down crying as she explained how HOA fees had nearly bankrupted her. "We need all of it," my lawyer said, recording testimonies. "Every fine, every threat, every instance of selective enforcement. We're not just building a case against individuals, we're exposing a corrupt system." Forensic analysis of the HOA's computers revealed software used to manipulate official documents, along with databases tracking problem residents and their vulnerabilities. They had detailed plans for using everything from noise complaints to pet regulations as weapons against homeowners who resisted their authority. The construction companies involved in the attempted demolition of my garden provided written statements about how they'd been pressured to participate in various HOA enforcement actions. One contractor admitted they'd been paid to deliberately damage properties that were under HOA scrutiny, making it easier to cite violations. As the evidence mounted, my lawyer filed additional motions, expanding the scope of our lawsuit. "This isn't just about your garden anymore," she explained. "We're challenging the entire framework that allows HOAs to operate with this kind of unchecked power." Federal investigators set up a hotline for residents to report HOA abuse, and the calls flooded in. Stories emerged of elderly residents forced from their homes, families bankrupted by arbitrary fines, and systematic discrimination masked as community standards enforcement. Barbara's carefully constructed empire was being dismantled document by document, testimony by testimony. But even as we built our case, her final words echoed in my mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She still had connections, resources, and years of experience manipulating the system. The question wasn't just whether we could prove what she'd done. It was whether we could prevent it from happening again, here or anywhere else. The battle had evolved from defending my property rights to exposing and reforming a system that had enabled abuse on a massive scale. What we didn't know then was that Barbara wasn't finished. Even as we gathered evidence against her, she was preparing a counterattack that would test not just our legal strategy, but the entire community's resolve to stand up for change. The courthouse was packed on the morning of our first major hearing. News crews lined the steps, and supporters filled every available seat in the courtroom. Barbara and her remaining loyal board members sat on one side, surrounded by a team of expensive lawyers. Our side of the courtroom was filled with Pine Valley residents, many holding documents ready to testify about years of abuse. The judge, an older woman named Patricia Henderson, studied the mountain of evidence before her with an increasingly furrowed brow. "Let me be clear," she began. "The allegations here are extraordinary. We have claims of systematic fraud, document manipulation, illegal surveillance, and organized harassment, all under the guise of Homeowners Association authority." Barbara's lead attorney, a slick corporate lawyer named James Maxwell, stood up. "Your Honor, these accusations are greatly exaggerated. The Pine Valley HOA has simply been maintaining community standards, as is their right and obligation." My lawyer was ready. She approached the bench with a cart full of evidence boxes. "Your Honor, we have documented proof of over 200 instances of document falsification." She began projecting examples on the courtroom screen. "Here are multiple versions of the same property deed, each altered to expand HOA control. Our forensic analysts have traced the changes directly to computers in the HOA office. The evidence was damning. Page after page showed how they had systematically modified documents, created false violations, and used intimidation to maintain control. Financial records revealed the complex web of shell companies they'd used to funnel community funds into private accounts. Maxwell attempted to interrupt. "Your Honor, these are complex administrative matters that should be handled internally." Internal. "Handling is exactly the problem," my lawyer countered. She called her first witness, Richard Thompson, the former HOA vice president who had turned against Barbara. Richard's testimony was explosive. He detailed how Barbara had built her power structure using a combination of legal threats, surveillance, and financial pressure to force compliance. She called it community management, he testified, but it was more like a protection racket. Pay the fees, follow her rules, or face the consequences. Now, Barbara sat stone-faced as Richard described their methods. He explained how they had targeted certain homes for takeover, using manufactured violations to force sales at below-market prices to pre-selected buyers. The testimony that seemed to impact the judge most came from elderly residents who had faced harassment. Mrs. Chen described how they had threatened to fine her for growing traditional Chinese vegetables in her backyard. The Patels detailed the discrimination they'd faced, masked as architectural standards enforcement. But Barbara's team wasn't going down without a fight. Maxwell presented their own evidence, carefully selected photos and documents painting the HOA's actions as reasonable community oversight. He argued that every action had been within their legal authority, every fine justified by written regulations. The turning point came when my lawyer presented the surveillance evidence. The courtroom fell silent as she showed footage of HOA officers photographing residents through windows, following children to school, and documenting every movement of targeted homeowners. This goes far beyond community standards enforcement, she argued. This is organized harassment, designed to intimidate and control an entire neighborhood. Judge Henderson's questions became increasingly pointed as the evidence mounted. She seemed particularly troubled by the financial records showing how HOA funds had been diverted through various shell companies. Your Honor, Maxwell tried one. Last time. These are simply standard operating procedures for modern homeowners associations. If you rule against us, it could destabilize HOA operations across the state. The judge removed her glasses, fixing Maxwell with a stern look. Mr. Maxwell, if these are standard procedures, then perhaps HOA operations need to be destabilized. I've seen evidence of document fraud, financial misconduct, and systematic harassment, all apparently considered standard by your clients. As the hearing concluded, Judge Henderson announced she would review all evidence before making her ruling. But her parting comments left little doubt about her thoughts. What I've seen today suggests not just individual misconduct, but a systemic abuse of power that demands serious examination. Barbara and her team huddled with their lawyers immediately after the hearing. Through the courthouse windows, we could see them gesturing angrily, clearly unhappy with how things had gone. What we didn't know then was that they had one final card to play, a desperate gambit that would throw not just our case, but the entire community into chaos. The legal battle had exposed their methods, but Barbara wasn't finished fighting, not by a long shot. Judge Henderson's ruling came down like a thunderbolt. The packed courtroom fell silent as she began reading from her decision, her voice clear and firm. In light of the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds that the Pine Valley Homeowners Association has engaged in a systematic pattern of fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. Her ruling was comprehensive and devastating. The HOA's authority was immediately suspended. All fines and pending violations were invalidated. A court-appointed administrator would take control of community operations, while a full investigation was conducted into years of financial misconduct. Furthermore, she continued, this court finds sufficient evidence of criminal conduct to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. Barbara's face turned ashen at these words. The judge turned to address the specific issues with my property. Regarding the plaintiff's property at 1242 Oak Corner, this court finds conclusively that it was never legally subject to HOA jurisdiction. All attempts to enforce HOA regulations on this property were unlawful, and all related fines are hereby voided. The victory felt surreal. Years of documented fraud had finally been exposed. The judge ordered the HOA to pay substantial damages to affected homeowners, with additional punitive damages for their attempted intimidation campaign. The actions of this HOA, Judge Henderson concluded, represent a grotesque abuse of power that this court cannot and will not condone. The pattern of document falsification, selective enforcement, and organized harassment demonstrates a level of corruption that threatens the very concept of community governance. As the judge finished reading her decision, the courtroom erupted in celebration. Neighbors hugged each other, some crying with relief. Mrs. Chen grabbed my hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally over." Richard Thompson, the former vice president who had helped expose the corruption, nodded to me from across the room. His testimony had been crucial in revealing the inner workings of Barbara's operation. My lawyer was beaming as she organized her papers. "This is more than just a victory for Pine Valley," she said. "This ruling sets a precedent. Other communities dealing with HOA abuse will be able to use this case as a blueprint for fighting back. Barbara and her remaining supporters slipped out a side door, their expensive lawyers already on their phones, presumably planning appeals. But the judge's ruling had been clear and comprehensive. Their power was broken. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed around us. The story of Pine Valley Falls had captured national attention, becoming a symbol of HOA reform. My lawyer handled most of the questions, explaining how the case could impact HOA governance across the country. Back in the neighborhood, the change was immediate and visible. The HOA security vehicles disappeared. The surveillance cameras came down. The floodlights that had made our lives miserable were removed. People began emerging from their houses, talking openly with neighbors without fear of being documented or fined. The court-appointed administrator moved quickly to stabilize community operations. Essential services would continue, but the oppressive system of rules and regulations was suspended pending review. For the first time in years, people could live in their homes without constant fear of violation notices or harassment. My garden project, which had sparked this entire conflict, could finally be completed. The Patel's children brought their chalk drawings back to the sidewalks. Mrs. Chen's traditional vegetables flourished in her backyard. The neighborhood was coming back to life. Standing in my yard that evening, looking at the partially finished raised beds that had started it all, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle, it was about standing up to systemic abuse and helping an entire community reclaim their homes and dignity. But as the sun set over Pine Valley Falls, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite finished. Barbara's final glare as she left the courthouse had carried a promise. This wasn't over. She had spent too many years building her power structure to let it go without a final fight. What I didn't know then was that the victory we were celebrating would face one last, desperate challenge, one that would test not just our legal win, but the entire community's commitment to change. The aftermath of the court victory brought a period of adjustment that none of us had fully anticipated. While the immediate threat of HOA harassment was gone, we found ourselves grappling with the impact of years of systematic control and intimidation. The neighborhood felt like it was waking up from a long nightmare, but the process wasn't always smooth. In the weeks following the ruling, I spent a lot of time reflecting on how everything had unfolded. The garden that had sparked this entire conflict was finally complete, but it had come to represent something far bigger than I'd ever intended. Each raised bed, now flourishing with vegetables and herbs, stood as a symbol of resistance against unchecked authority. The court-appointed administrator discovered the full extent of the HOA's influence on daily life. They had regulated everything, from the acceptable shade of white for house trim to the permitted height of garden gnomes. People had lived in fear of arbitrary rules that served no purpose except to maintain control. Many neighbors struggled to adjust to their newfound freedom. Years of conditioning had left its mark. Mrs. Chen told me how she still caught herself checking for surveillance cars before gardening. The Patels admitted they initially felt nervous about letting their children play freely in the front yard. "It's like learning to breathe again," one elderly resident explained during a community meeting. "For years, we lived under this constant pressure, always worried about breaking some rule we didn't even know existed. Now we have to remember how to just live." The financial impact of Barbara's regime became clearer as forensic accountants continued their investigation. Millions of dollars had been funneled through various shell companies. Some residents had been forced into financial hardship by excessive fines and fees, while board members had enriched themselves through fraudulent contracts. My lawyer helped establish a community recovery program, using funds from the court settlement to assist those who had suffered the most under the HOA's rule. The Hendersons, who had been forced to sell their home at a loss, were among the first to receive compensation. The physical transformation of the neighborhood was gradual but significant. People began making small changes to their properties, planting flowers, painting doors, adding personal touches that had been forbidden under the HOA's strict rules. Each change, no matter how minor, felt like an act of reclaiming our homes. But not everyone embraced the change. A small group of residents, mostly former allies of Barbara, complained about the decline in standards. They pointed to every untrimmed bush or uniquely painted mailbox as evidence that the neighborhood was descending into chaos. The most difficult adjustments came in rebuilding trust between neighbors. Years of encouraged surveillance and reporting had created deep divisions. People who had been pressured to inform on their neighbors now had to face those same neighbors at community events. I found myself becoming an unofficial mediator in many of these situations. My fight against the HOA had given me a certain credibility, and people often sought my advice on handling disputes or interpreting the new, simplified community guidelines. The garden became a gathering place, ironically, fulfilling its original purpose in ways I hadn't expected. Neighbors would stop by to share gardening tips, swap stories about life under the HOA, or just enjoy the peaceful space that had once been the center of so much conflict. Mrs. Chen started a community gardening program, teaching others how to grow the vegetables she had once been fined for cultivating. The Patels organized weekly children's art sessions on their driveway, transforming the sidewalks into colorful canvases of childhood creativity. But even as we worked to rebuild our community, there were signs that not everything was settled. Strange rumors began circulating about Barbara's whereabouts and activities. Former board members reported receiving mysterious phone calls. Documents continued to surface, revealing even deeper layers of corruption and manipulation. One evening, as I worked in my garden, Mrs. Chen hurried over with troubling news. "Something's happening," she whispered. "Barbara's been seen meeting with developers at the edge of town. People are saying she's planning something big." Looking around at the peaceful neighborhood we'd fought so hard to reclaim, I realized that while we'd won the battle against HOA tyranny, we might have overlooked something crucial. Barbara hadn't just lost control of Pine Valley Falls. She'd lost her entire power base, years of carefully accumulated influence and wealth. History had taught us that people like Barbara rarely accept defeat gracefully. As the sun set over my flourishing garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to face one final challenge, one that would determine not just the future of our neighborhood, but the very nature of community governance itself. The ripple effects of our victory against the Pine Valley HOA spread far beyond our neighborhood. Local news coverage turned into national attention as other communities began examining their own HOA practices. Our story had struck a nerve, revealing a widespread pattern of abuse that many had experienced but few had successfully challenged. Reporters began showing up regularly, asking to interview residents about life before and after the HOA's downfall. The contrast was stark. Where once there had been silent streets and fearful neighbors, now there was vibrant community life. Children played freely, gardens flourished, and people actually talked to each other without fear of being reported for unauthorized social gatherings. The impact reached state level when legislators began drafting new HOA reform bills, often citing Pine Valley Falls as an example of why oversight was needed. My lawyer was invited to testify at legislative hearings, bringing our experience to bear on proposals for stricter regulation of homeowners associations. But the most profound changes were happening right in our community. The story of our fight became a catalyst for other neighborhoods. HOA board members from surrounding communities began reaching out, asking for advice on reforming their own practices. Some even invited residents to help rewrite their bylaws, creating more democratic and transparent systems. Mrs. Chen's community garden program had expanded beyond our neighborhood, drawing people from all over the city. The Patel's children's art program had inspired similar initiatives in other communities. What had started as acts of defiance against HOA control had become models for building genuine community connection. However, not everyone celebrated these changes. A vocal minority, mostly consisting of former HOA supporters, continued to protest what they saw as the degradation of community standards. They pointed to every personal expression of creativity or individuality as evidence of declining. The tension came to a head during a town hall meeting about proposed HOA reforms. Barbara's remaining supporters arrived with presentations showing cherry-picked examples of decline in communities without strict HOA control. They argued passionately for maintaining the status quo of rigid enforcement and surveillance. But then something remarkable happened. One by one, residents from Pine Valley Falls stood up to share their stories. The elderly couple who could finally afford their medications now that they weren't paying excessive HOA fines. The young family who had been able to buy their first home because property prices weren't artificially inflated by HOA fees. The immigrant family who could at last celebrate their cultural traditions without fear of violation notices. The meeting became a turning point in the larger conversation about community governance. People began to question the fundamental premise that strict control and uniformity were necessary for maintaining property values and community standards. Real estate data supported our side. Property values in Pine Valley Falls had actually increased since the HOA's dissolution, driven by demand from buyers attracted to the neighborhood's new reputation for diversity and genuine community spirit. Local businesses noticed the change too. The removal of strict signage and operating restrictions brought new life to our small commercial district. A family-owned cafe opened where once only chain stores had been permitted. The weekly farmers market, previously restricted by HOA rules, became a bustling community hub. But amid all this positive change, there were whispers of concern. Barbara had been spotted meeting with developers and city officials. Former board members reported receiving calls about a new opportunity for community management. Something was brewing. The warning signs were subtle at first. Mysterious surveyors taking measurements at the edge of our neighborhood. Unmarked cars photographing properties. Rumors of large land purchases in adjacent areas. Then came the announcement that shocked everyone. A new planned community was being developed on land bordering Pine Valley Falls. The developer, a corporation with ties to Barbara Whitmore. The marketing materials promised proper community management and traditional neighborhood values, code words we all recognized. It became clear that Barbara wasn't just planning a new development. She was creating what she saw as a counterpoint to our liberated community, a place where her vision of total control could be rebuilt from the ground up. The implications were troubling. While we had won our freedom from HOA tyranny, Barbara was preparing to export her model of control to a new location, potentially affecting hundreds of future homeowners. Our victory, it seemed, had only been the beginning. The real question now was, could we prevent history from repeating itself, or would Barbara succeed in creating a new power base for her brand of community control? The final chapter of our story unfolded in unexpected ways. Barbara's new development project, ironically, named Liberty Heights, became both a challenge and an opportunity. As details of her plans emerged, it became clear she intended to create an even more restrictive community than Pine Valley Falls had been, with unprecedented levels of control built into the property deeds from the start. But this time, we were ready, Our experience fighting the HOA had taught us valuable lessons, and we had something powerful on our side, a documented history of what such unfettered control could lead to. My lawyer helped organize a coalition of homeowners, civil rights, attorneys, and community advocates. We began investigating the development plans, discovering that Barbara had attempted to hide her involvement through layers of shell companies. When we exposed these connections, along with her history of HOA abuse, potential investors started backing out. The media attention that followed was intense. Local news stations ran special reports comparing the proposed restrictions at Liberty Heights with the documented abuses at Pine Valley Falls. Potential buyers, armed with this information, began questioning the development's draconian rules and excessive fees. But the real turning point came from an unexpected source: former HOA board members from Pine Valley Falls. Several of them, including Richard Thompson, came forward to testify about their experiences working under Barbara's leadership. Their accounts of systematic abuse, financial manipulation, and intentional harassment were devastating. The final blow to Barbara's plans came when state legislators, spurred by our ongoing advocacy, passed new HOA reform laws. These regulations, nicknamed the Pine Valley Rules, set strict limits on HOA powers and required unprecedented levels of transparency and accountability. Barbara's development project, unable to implement the controlling measures she'd planned, eventually failed. The land was purchased by a community land trust, which worked with residents to create something entirely different, a neighborhood built on principles of genuine community involvement and democratic governance. Looking back now, standing in my flourishing garden where this all began, I can see how much has changed. The raised beds that once sparked such conflict now supply vegetables for our community food bank. The greenhouse Barbara tried to prevent has become a teaching space where children learn about sustainable gardening. Mrs. Chen's influence spread far beyond her dumplings and gardening tips. She now leads workshops on community building for other neighborhoods. The Patel's children, once afraid to draw with chalk on their own driveway, are teaching art classes in the community center. Pine Valley Falls has become a model for what communities can be when people work together instead of against each other. Property values have risen, not because of strict rules and enforcement, but because people genuinely want to live in a place where neighbors know and support each other. The HOA still exists, but in a radically different form. It's now a voluntary association focused on community enhancement rather than control. Decisions are made transparently, with real input from residents. The old system of fines and violations has been replaced with community mediation and mutual support. As for Barbara, I heard she moved to another state, presumably to try her tactics elsewhere. But her legacy here isn't what she intended. Instead of being remembered as a powerful HOA president, she became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of standing up to systemic abuse. The garden that started it all has become something of a local landmark. People visit from other communities, seeking advice on how to reform their own HOAs or build better neighborhoods. Each visitor leaves with not just gardening tips, but with a deeper understanding of what true community means. The lessons we learned through this struggle continue to resonate. We discovered that real community strength doesn't come from rigid rules or threatening fines, but from neighbors supporting each other, celebrating differences, and working together to solve problems. My corner lot, once the battlefield for a neighborhood war, is now a gathering place where people share stories, swap plants, and build the kinds of connections that no HOA could ever mandate. The victory we won wasn't just about defeating an oppressive system, it was about creating something better in its place. As I tend to my garden now, I often think about how a simple desire to grow vegetables led to such profound changes. Sometimes, the biggest battles start with the smallest actions, and the most important victories aren't just about what we overcome, but what we build in its place. The story of Pine Valley Falls continues to inspire others to question and challenge systems of control in their own communities. And while our struggle against HOA tyranny may be over, the work of building and maintaining genuine community never really ends. It requires constant care and attention, just like my garden. But the results are worth every effort. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Now we